Good afternoon, good evening. I'm KIRILL Gerstein, and welcome to today's seminar, part of KIRILL Gerstein Invites, hosted at Eisler Lab at the Hanns Eisler Musik Hochschule in Berlin. But we're in a virtual space, and it's lovely to welcome all of you, whether you are in Europe or North America or joining from elsewhere. And I'm thrilled to have Anthony Fogg, Tony Fogg, as I sometimes may call him. And Tony is a dear friend and a figure in the arts world that I think commands deserved respect and admiration for his very strong handwriting in programming of the Boston Symphony for the past I think 25 years. He'll correct me if I'm wrong, as well as Tanglewood and the commissioning activities that the Boston Symphony is so involved in historically and currently, as well as the educational component of Tanglewood. So he's an incredible figure, not least a pianist, an accomplished pianist, and so really a musical figure that has shaped much listening in our world and brought many pieces into being, including the piece that you just heard, the Thomas Adès Piano Concerto, and he'll talk about that later as well. So I'll stop talking and just turn it over to Tony. It's wonderful to have you with us.
KIRILL, it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's very nice to be meeting everyone virtually. I know some colleagues from the orchestral world are part of this seminar, and others who are just interested to know some of the basics about the sort of work that happens behind the scenes in putting on concerts. So it's great to be meeting you all. I'm sorry it's not in person. And it was also wonderful to hear that performance of Tom's Piano Concerto played so fantastically by KIRILL. You know, that was a project that is very dear to my heart, and I think is a very good example of the way that one can create a through line in terms of composers, performers, organizational relationships, how one can be able, if one has the possibilities to marshal the resources of an institution to support the creation of new work and of artists one really believes in. So KIRILL, I'm so glad that we played that. It's a CD that's going through the roof, I believe. So anyone who hasn't heard it or purchased it, go online. I also feel somewhat embarrassed that you're introducing me as a pianist, because I have very, very rusty fingers these days. During this period, I've been living close to Tanglewood. I have a nice little garden, so these fingers are spending more time pulling out weeds than they are practicing the well-tempered clavier, I'm sorry to say, but it certainly is part of my makeup. I thought I may just do a little self-biography, if I may, just to sort of set the scene a little bit, and then we can get into some more detailed discussion. I'm from Australia originally, and I started out my musical training, as KIRILL said, as a pianist, and also in areas of musicology. And come the end of my education, I really didn't know where I was going to end up. I knew that I didn't have the sort of commanding technique that one needs to play the Rachmaninoff Third or the Busoni Concerto. But I had some skills in new music and in collaborative work, and I thought that maybe that was the way forward for me. What I'd always had was a sort of very broad range of musical interests and tastes, and I spent a lot of time from a young age, listening to music in recorded form. Eventually, I grew up in a small country town, so I didn't have an orchestra to hear on any sort of regular basis. So but I was a fanatical listener to the radio, and I built up an LP collection and so on. So I went out into the world, doing a bunch of things at first, doing some teaching. I played for a new music ensemble. I played for a number of singers, and one thing just led to another. The administrator of the new music ensemble left, and they said, "Look, can you just look after the organizational things, for a couple of days a week in addition to playing?" And of course, a couple of days a week turns into 24/7, as we all know. And I felt quite relaxed doing all of this type of work as well as playing. And then eventually I started, I realized that I needed to somehow condense everything, and got a job working for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, doing the programming for the orchestras there. The ABC, as it's called, at the time managed 6 symphony orchestras around the country, and they had a rather unique system where they had a central office that did the programming for all 6 of the orchestras. It was a very unusual and old-fashioned approach, basically relating to the days when artists would make the long voyage to Australia to undertake a tour for the ABC. And so it needed to be all coordinated. But I was all of a sudden there at a very young age, and being given an opportunity way, way beyond my skill level, working on the programming for the 6 orchestras around the country. And it was me sitting in an office in Sydney and working on programs for the orchestra in Perth, where I'd never even visited, let alone heard the orchestra in person. So it was a very sharp learning curve. But it brought together, I think, a number of the skills that I had, not only knowledge of repertoire, but just ability to organize musical material, to align it with the sort of administrative skills that one needs of being able to budget and make the case for any particular musical cause or idea that you wanted to try and bring forward. And meanwhile, I was still playing the piano quite a lot, and it felt quite natural. And in fact, I must say, the fact that I was still a practicing musician, I think, gave me a certain advantage when I was working with artists, because they somehow felt that I understood what it was like to have to go out onto a stage and reveal oneself before the public. And certainly I was working with a number of the artists that I was also engaging. So it was a sort of a special situation that I enjoyed. And so little by little, I worked for the ABC, started to make some contacts in the broader musical world, and started to travel around a little bit more and meet with agents. And that led to my being invited to come to work with the Boston Symphony. And I was completely surprised. It wasn't a job that I applied for or anything like that. It was just a casual meeting with someone over a dinner in Amsterdam that led to that person recommending me for the job that I now occupy. So as Kirill mentioned, I've been here for 25 years now, and my work involves planning all of the programs for the Boston Symphony, either in its winter subscription season here at Tanglewood, on tour. I'm integrally involved in our recording activities and commissioning and so on. And here at Tanglewood, we present not only the orchestra in a number of concerts throughout the summer, but a series of significant recitals in the Seiji Ozawa Hall. We also have 2 very significant education programs: the Tanglewood Music Center, which is a pre-professional program for instrumentalists, singers, conductors, composers, and as of last year, a new entity called the Tanglewood Learning Institute, which is an adult education program revolving around the programming of the festival. So Tanglewood is a mighty big operation. It's slumbering down the road now. I went and wandered around the grounds the other day, which are still a source of great inspiration. But we've had to make the decision, and maybe this is a subject we can talk about a little later on, to revert from an in-person festival to an online festival, and that's been quite a challenge. So in terms of the BSO, though, I'm very much the starting point for a lot of things that happen in the organization. I sort of, my work and the creation of my calendar sets the agenda for many different departments. It informs what our fundraising needs to be. It relates to our educational activities, to archives. I have to work, of course, very closely with the press and marketing team to make sure that our product is presented to the public and offered in just the right way. So I'm involved in lots of different areas of the organization, and I have to be very mindful and careful about how our resources are deployed, both the budget that I have and our human resources. So it's a mighty big challenge, but we do so with a very small team. So I've worked now with 3 different music directors in my time at the BSO. When I came here, Seiji Ozawa was the music director. I then had the great honor of working with James Levine for a number of years. And of course, now in the last 5 seasons with Andres Nelsons, who is a unique and wonderful human being and a conductor of enormous stature. So it's great to be partnering with Andres in making all of our plans and realizing them. So look, that's sort of my little autobiography. And Kirill, I don't know what we should take from all of that and where that might lead us in our discussion.
Well, I think many questions, and possibly, hopefully, I'll echo some of the questions of our colleagues listening in. But I think it would be interesting because I know, even though I've been circulating in the so-called concert market, but still, I think one knows too little about how an artistic administrator such as yourself really goes about, let's say, planning a symphony season. I think that's a big starting point from repertoire choice to obviously the conductors and the soloists and the orchestra and how that all comes together. And then I think then we can get into the modern music and championing that, as well as the educational component. But what happens? Tell us, what's your lab?
Well, I'm working roughly, I would say, in about a 5-year horizon of time. And within that 5-year horizon, there are various levels of specificity and detail. So the furthest out in any element of programming and planning may be that in season 5 years from now, we, in theory, think that we're going to be doing a European festivals tour, for instance. We plan our touring with some regularity of countries and regions. So we may do a festivals tour every 3 or 4 seasons. We may go to Japan every 3 years. We may do a North American tour every 2nd or 3rd year. So we may know that in 5 seasons out, we're in theory planning to do a European tour, and we will start some discussions with our European representatives to talk about what that might include. There may be a very, very notional idea of what the repertoire could be if there were a particular composer emphasis or an anniversary that we were thinking that we would in part celebrate. But 5 years out, it's a little sketchy. There may be at the 4-year mark, there may be, for instance, a couple of commissions in place from some major composers who need a long lead time to undertake a new work. It's a lot to get on their schedule, as it was for Tom Addis, for instance. We'd been in conversations with Tom for many years before the catalyst of working with KIRILL came into play, and we were then able to work out a commission with him. But at about the 4-year mark, there might be some commissions in place, and there may be the periods in which our music director will be with us. And then working back from that, we get to more specific details. So in about 3 years from now, 3 seasons from now, we'll have the music director's periods certainly confirmed. We would have a list of the major guest conductors who would be working with us that season. We would have a handful of the major soloists, and we would certainly have some of our new music and our commissions really plotted and placed throughout the season. Getting a little closer, as you get the idea, it just fills out. And I always try to make sure that we don't overcommit, that we leave some space to be able to respond to any new artistic opportunity. It may be a young artist who all of a sudden appears on the scene, and we think it would be a great opportunity to work with them at an early stage of their careers, to establish a rapport early on. And so we may just, I may leave a couple of weeks completely open in any season till a couple of years before. And then we can take that opportunity to, in a timely way, fill in some detail that is more current. Likewise, there may be a younger composer who emerges, who doesn't quite need the lead time to create a new piece for us that one of the more senior colleagues would be. So we can likewise put a new work by a younger composer into the schedule. So it's a little like putting, I always use the analogy, it's a little like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle, that you have some of the key pieces in place for each season, and that informs in a way what the overall impression will be and the overall picture of a season will be. You start with, of course, the projects that the music director wants to undertake. If it's going to be a concert opera, that's a fairly critical piece of planning. If we have a tour, either an international tour or our regular performances in Carnegie Hall, we'll need to plug in the repertoire for those programs fairly early on, because in terms of presenters in other countries, there might be a clash list of works that are already committed elsewhere, and so one needs to get the repertoire that we want to perform established and registered with the festivals or with Carnegie. So you get the major building blocks in place, and then little by little you flesh out the whole program. And sometimes one goes into a season with some well-formed or general ideas about what you might like to see in a season, and then in the end it works out quite differently for whatever reasons. I'm more of an analog guy than a digital guy, and I tend to like to see everything on one page, and I like a simple grid, and that helps me see where the hot spots in any season are. And by the hot spots, I mean what is the sequence of programming for the orchestra that is going to make the greatest sense. If we had 3 weeks of programs, including a very, very high proportion of repertoire that was unfamiliar or new to them, and I don't just mean new music, but there are plenty of works by Haydn and so on that we've never performed. So one needs to find the balance of familiar and unfamiliar in terms of the orchestra's energies. We also need to think where, if it's a conductor making his or her debut, where is the best place in the season to position such an artist? It would be someone who the orchestra doesn't know as their ways of working. They will be a little anxious about, the familiarity level with them. So it's probably best if a debut conductor's week is surrounded by guest conductors who are well established with the orchestra, that the orchestra will know what to expect from those conductors, and will have a free and much easier starting position when it comes to a debut conductor. So having a one page like that for me is the simplest way of just getting the overall picture, and you can see what the patterns are, both in terms of the flow of repertoire, of where our marketing team is going to perhaps need a little bit more muscle to promote some programs that may be a bit more challenging. The times of year, if it's the middle of January in Boston can be pretty bitter, thinking about the experience of going to a concert at that time of year, and how the programming might relate to that. So it's a process of little by little chipping away until we get the final lineup for any season, and then it's a matter of then launching it to the world through our marketing team, the press office, and so on. And I do spend a lot of time just talking through the product, describing everything about what the essence of a program is, what might be particularly interesting about an artist who may be new to us, what their profile is, or what their history with the orchestra is over a long period of time. So just making sure that everyone really understands what it is that we're trying to share with the public. And I've found that is perhaps one of the most successful ways of making sure that the integrity and the real essence of what we're doing is maintained at all points of the process.
And that does sound like a very big jigsaw puzzle. And then I've been jotting, as you've been speaking, some questions that arise, and maybe picking on the most recent one that you just said, speaking to marketing. And so marketing versus programming, or hopefully the synergy of the programming department and the marketing department. But it would be interesting to know how dependent you are on the marketing consideration, and how idealistic you can be about certain things. Certainly from the outside, the BSO seems masterfully idealistic in the things that you present to the public that end up being well attended, but it would be interesting to hear you talk about that.
Many orchestras all operate in different ways in terms of the internal dynamics. I think we have a very healthy balance between the ideas and ideals of the artistic area and the hopes and needs of the marketing team. I think the most important part of all of this is really just communication and being able to explain why one should be doing something. I think, it would be foolhardy of me to create a season that I knew would be impossible for the marketing team to promote. So part of the challenge is really to find that that sweet spot, the right mix between what will be fairly straightforward for them to promote, and then what's going to need a little bit more help. And I think it's a matter of mutual trust, that we've worked together, and that I am prepared to spend a lot of time talking with the team and helping them and explaining to them, and I read every press release about the season that goes out, and so on. So it's a matter of me investing in it as much as it is they're trusting me. Of course, I spend a lot of time looking at the information that they get from our audiences. We do regular audience surveys, and we get feedback, on a daily basis through customer service, and that's always very, very interesting. And ultimately, one just has to sort of steer a middle ground with all of this to try and find exactly the right balance. And balance is something that keeps coming back and back in in all of the work that I do and that we all do in this field, and just striking that right balance is really the big challenge. And it's different for every institution, different for different audiences, different personalities of orchestras, of cities. You know, we're lucky in Boston in that we have, I think, a musically very literate audience, and so one can assume certain basics in terms of their understanding of the musical language. It's also an audience that, to a large extent, has been with us for a very long period, and that's a very useful dimension to think about, especially in terms of new music. And maybe it's a subject we can touch on in a moment, Kirill, when we're talking about how to program new music.
And generally, so just stepping back slightly, what are some of the surprises possibly in terms of what makes it an easier program to market or a more difficult? Is it typically for you the repertoire that is either more scary or more easier to get the people to come for, or is it the soloists that known or not known, or is it the conductor that may be known or not known? What are some of the things that seem to really have an effect? Let's starting with, is it more repertoire driven, the problems and the successes, or is it more the performer driven problems and successes?
Look, I think it's a combination of both of those, and getting the balance right between the profile of a soloist, for instance, and the repertoire that they're going to perform is really critical. If it's a soloist who's been well established in the broader market or in the local market, the audiences know what to expect. They trust them, and they're known to bring along a certain category of repertoire. And Kirill, you're a very good example, because with the exception of your debut at Tanglewood, in which you played the Tchaikovsky Concerto, you've essentially played somewhat left of center repertoire with the Boston Symphony. Tom Addis's In 7 Days, the Prokofiev First Concerto, Tom's new piano concerto, the Busoni Concerto. What people recognize when they see your name is that here's someone who really delivers a fantastic performance, and they will trust that whatever we've agreed that you will be performing is something that you're going to bring off with tremendous skill and very persuasively. If we were to attempt some of the repertoire that you've played with an artist who is unknown to them, I'm not sure that we would have had quite the same success. So there's that balance between the soloist and the repertoire. I think I will have to be honest that probably the soloist and the repertoire are the stronger determinants of a program's popularity than the conductor on the whole. Of course, there are conductors who people will come to hear whatever they're doing. There are a handful of those. There are far more soloists who are able to have the same draw, I must say. So that's, I think, a reality of the marketplace.
And in terms of, so what scares the audience? Is it right to deduce then, essentially, is it the unknown that when you said when they know what to expect, so is the opposite true? Is it that when they don't know what to expect, this is when potentially there is, well, let's say, a problematic or slightly more worse week that you need to present to them, or is that a wrong deduction?
No, I think that's a fairly good deduction, but I think, one has to look at the context. If you're going to present a completely unknown composer, whether it be a new work or an existing work, putting it in the sort of context in which the audience will feel a certain comfort level, I think is very important. And also putting it in a context where we know that the orchestra can adequately prepare this completely unknown score in the available rehearsal time. Typically, we have, for a subscription program, we have 4 rehearsals. So 3 rehearsals of 2.5 hours, 1 rehearsal of 2 hours. And there is really a sort of finite amount of music that one can properly prepare within that setup and that scheme. So I think part of my job is to make sure that we have the right sort of balance within programs, that the orchestra will come in and not be overwhelmed by having to absorb a huge amount of new or unfamiliar music, that there's enough there, whether it be knowing the language of a composer or a work that is, you know, in their minds and in their psyches very easily, that can be brought back, and therefore we are able to devote a little more time to the new or the unfamiliar piece in any program.
So one of the things that you need to do, aside from the programming, marketing, and idealistic concepts, you need to also be thinking how much of it can be absorbed by the orchestra in that given week.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier anniversaries, and one is tempted to ask, as I think John Gilhooly once said to me, that, oh, anniversaries, it's a lazy man's programming guide. And I see his point, but how important are these, do you think? How important are they to you, and knowing your interests in our conversations in the past? I know that, you know, you're constantly engaged, and it's not about anniversaries, but how much does that really help marketing, for example, in your opinion? That, say it's the Tchaikovsky year, well, forget about the Beethoven year currently, we can speak about that later, but generally, how much is it that we want to believe that this matters, and how much do you think it actually matters?
Anniversaries and themes can often lead one down a rabbit hole, I must say, because you can be pursuing a theme, or you can be pursuing an anniversary celebration to a degree that ultimately is not going to lead you to a good program, and that has to be the bottom line. I think sometimes composer anniversaries, you know, take on, you know, a worldwide celebratory dimension. And in terms of both audiences and our marketing team, they like to think that they're part of this big movement, and, you know, comparisons of what we're doing versus what another orchestra is doing. But I think ultimately it's got to be something that is really meaningful. I think the most recent example that I can give you that we really pursued in a very, very active way was the celebration of Leonard Bernstein's 100th birthday in summer of 2018. And Bernstein, of course, was a major figure at Tanglewood. He was part of the first class of the Tanglewood Music Center in 1940. He was a regular teacher at Tanglewood practically every year from there on. He was a major figure on the podium, conducting the BSO, teacher. So he was someone who, I think, for us mattered more than he did for other orchestras. And so we really tried to do as comprehensive a view of Bernstein's work during the 2018 season. And it was not only programming, I think, a very good representation of his work in all genres, in the concert pieces, the theater pieces, some whatever the chamber music is, there's not a lot of it. But we also went back and looked at the repertoire that he championed over the years. What were the pieces that he did often at Tanglewood? And you know, it just wasn't Tchaikovsky 5, it was, you know, Haydn masses and various symphonies of Sibelius and so on. So it built out, I think, a very good picture of Bernstein in many dimensions, as a composing artist, as a conductor, and also in the educational field. And then we, of course, did a big gala concert to celebrate all of that. But it was, I thought, for me, it was a very satisfying way of approaching that celebration. A number of years ago, with James Levine, we, over a 2-year period, did a cycle of programs combining the music of Beethoven and Schoenberg. And we tried to draw the parallels between the two and to show how just as Beethoven was a revolutionary figure, so too was Schoenberg in his time. And so we were able to do, for instance, concert performances of Fidelio juxtaposed with Moses and Aaron, the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto juxtaposed with the Schoenberg Concerto, piano Concerto, and so on. And I thought that was a very illuminating way of approaching this. And we had, in each season, we probably had, I'd say, half a dozen programs pursuing this theme. And certainly you started to see the parallels in terms of approach to form, the way that both composers took the language that they inherited and developed in completely new ways. So for me, that was a meaningful thing, whereas just saying that in a Schubert year we're going to play all of Schubert's symphonies or whatever is perhaps a little less persuasive than doing a very specific deep dive into a composer's work or into a particular theme. Another interesting programming theme that we developed a number of years ago, and this was one of my first seasons, was music coinciding with the conclusion of the Second World War. It was around the 50th anniversary, and exploring the idea of how music relates to its time and how music can be responsive to so many of the emotional or political things that are happening at their time of composition, and seeing how that speaks to a broader public. And so that theme of World War II is, I think, a very interesting one. But you can often, as I said, you can often go down a rabbit hole pursuing something to the point that it really loses its real strength as a program standing alone.
Yeah, that makes sense, and in some way, it seems to parallel what has become a trend in the arts world of curation, not by monochromatic theme, but rather by juxtaposing and how these things throw light at each other. And then obviously the Boston Symphony, as I said at the beginning, is historically a very important center, or as fashionable to say, incubator for new music. And there are some incredible commissions from the Symphony of Psalms and Concerto for Orchestra, just to name the two recent Adès Concerto. Talk about that component, please. That component of the season and that component of your activity of programming new music or newer music that perhaps already exists, and commissioning new pieces and balancing them when you integrate them into the season.
Well, new music has always been part of the Boston Symphony's DNA, so to speak. The orchestra's very first conductor was Georg Henschel, who was not only a very fine conductor by all accounts, but a prolific composer. He was also a baritone soloist. And he often included his own music in the programs of the first season of the orchestra. So having new music was always part of the orchestra's regular set of offerings. Of course, this came into greater prominence with the appointment of Serge Koussevitzky as music director in the late 1920s. He started in 1925, I think. But he was an incredible personality and had incredible imagination, and somehow had this belief that he could help establish some new American school of composition. And before he'd even arrived on the job, he met with Nadia Boulanger in Paris and said, look, I'm taking this position in Boston. I want to, find the most interesting and the most engaging young American talent. How can you help me? And she said, well, look, there's a young student who's been working with me here, Aaron Copeland, and of course, the rest is history. But Koussevitzky's approach was not just a sort of scattering of this composer and that. He really invested in composers that he believed in. So there were multiple commissions for Copeland. There were multiple commissions for Martinu. He constantly brought in the newest pieces of Stravinsky and Prokofiev, the composers that he'd in part been responsible for promoting back in Russia. So there was this sort of consistency of exposure to certain composers that the Boston audience had. And he was very brave that, he would program a work to be played twice within the same program before it had even been written, because he just somehow had a feeling that this was going to be a great work. He was also very clever in that he could offer sets of conditions to composers at exactly the right time and exactly the right way. I've, for instance, looked at all of the correspondence around the commission of Messiaen's Turangalila, and Koussevitzky basically offered Messiaen carte blanche. He said, you can write a piece of whatever duration, whatever size orchestra, you can deliver it whenever it's finished, and we will play it. And of course, we ended up with one of the masterpieces of the 20th century, because this was just the opportunity that Messiaen needed, and he was on such a basis able to create a musical canvas that incorporated so many of his ideas of composition to that point. He was able to include the big piano solo and the En Martineau solos, of course, because there'd be no restrictions about whether the piece should have a soloist or not. So it was a golden opportunity for Messiaen, and he responded appropriately. Likewise, the commission to Bartók for what became the Concerto for Orchestra came at a time when Koussevitzky knew that Bartók was already ill. He was living in New York under very impoverished conditions, and it was just the support and the impetus that he needed to be able to find new reserves of energy, and of course created one of the masterpieces of our time. So he had these sort of instincts about who to approach and when, and what parameters to offer them for any commission. And I think that tells us a great deal. And the consistency of support for any composer, I think, is a very important part of promotion of new music, that we just don't hear a piece by a composer once. We hear several pieces by that composer, perhaps over several years, that the audience builds up some understanding of the musical language, that they know that they don't come in frightened about a new piece by composer X, because they've had the experience of these works previously. During James Levine's period as music director, for instance, he strongly supported and promoted the music of Elliott Carter. And this was perhaps a musical language that was unfamiliar, extreme to many people. But gradually there was a greater understanding of Carter's music. Having this distinguished older figure present at all of the performances, of course, was a great boon and a boost in itself. So, Jim was really committed to this. I also had a very interesting experience fairly early on in my time at the BSO, and we programmed a percussion concerto by Takemitsu for percussion quartet and orchestra called From Me Flows What You Call Time. It was written for the Canadian group Nexus, and the BSO had premiered the piece, I think, in about 1988 or 1989. And so talking with Seiji, we thought, wouldn't it be good to bring it back? And I sat there during the performance, and it's a very, very, very sparse and spare work with, you know, just events happening in great isolation. And there's a sort of somewhat theatrical element to it with these beautiful ribbons that come from the ceiling down to the percussion players. But it's a very, very spare, a longish piece, over half an hour. And I sat there thinking, oh my God, you know, how is the audience going to take to this? And I was quite worried. I thought, oh, you know, this is just going to be, you know, received very unenthusiastically. They went crazy at the end, and I was only wandering around the hallway at the intermission that it hadn't come home to me that over many years Seiji had played and presented a lot of music by Takemitsu, and I could hear our clever Boston audience saying, "Oh, look, I remember when we had that piece, Dream Window, or Archipelago S," and I thought, well, you know, even though we hadn't played a lot of Toru's music in a couple of years, there was still the sort of residue in their minds of knowing what his style was about, of the familiarity with his music, that they felt comfortable to come into this new piece, and they already had a good starting point in terms of being able to absorb the composer's musical language and the ideas put forth in this particular work. So, and I think bringing us up to the current time, you know, we've had the great pleasure of working with Tom Addis now for a period of, gosh, I guess 10 years. The last 4 of which he's been our artistic partner, and we've managed to present most of his major orchestra pieces, excerpts from The Tempest, as well as his brand new premiere this past season of the piano concerto. So, you know, I think we've done a good job in really forging some real understanding of this important composer's work.
And tell me, you mentioned it a little bit, and I'm tempted to pick on it both as it concerns the modern pieces or newer pieces, as well as, let's say in my case, when often as a pianist I'll hear from one of my managers say, well, you know, I don't want to do Brahms concertos because they've had them 3 years. And I think, well, there are only 2 Brahms concertos, and they're pretty excellent pieces. So, so it brings me to the point of asking about the recurrence of pieces. Both, you mentioned Kusevitsky could sometimes dare to play the same new piece twice in the program. You are bringing some of the BSO commissions back quite quickly, such as the piano concerto, which is great. But what are some of the, let's say, guiding thoughts there on how soon is too soon to bring an old or new piece back in the program? Let's say a new piece or a Brahms piano concerto.
Kirill, the thing about the so-called core canon, the central repertoire, some people say war horses, is that great works of art are ones that you are constantly finding new dimensions to. That there's, in every performance, there's something that you've not seen or you'd missed before. So I think we have an obligation to continue to present those, to continue to present some of the central works of the repertoire, for that reason, that they are great works, that they've stood the test of time. Our job in many ways in terms of new music is to bring pieces into existence and then allow history to do some of the sorting and shuffling after that. I think one always gets a sense at a first performance whether a piece has been effective on whatever level, whether it be in terms of the audience response or the orchestra's engagement to it. And that can very much help us to decide whether, you know, 3 seasons later is a good time to bring back a new work, or 2 seasons later, or whether we repeat a piece at Tanglewood that we'd played in the winter season. So it's really just a matter of good judgment. There are a number of pieces within my tenure that we have done a number of times because I think they've been clear masterpieces. And I think of works like Henri Dutilleux's The Shadows of Time that we've played on a number of occasions now, and it's one of those pieces that you keep hearing more and more amazing things each time you come back to the piece. So look, it's a matter of balancing out everything. You know, it's always a real dilemma. Do you, if you've only got so many spots where you can bring in unfamiliar in terms of the overall balance, unfamiliar work into the season, what's the better investment? Is it in a brand new piece, or is it in bringing back something that we've had a couple of years ago? And that's always a dilemma. And I don't think there's any clear-cut answer to that question.
I will also start turning to some of the questions from our colleagues that are attending, and they lead to the questions I have. So we have here, for example, tonight Benoit Fromanger, who is a wonderful flutist. I think, if I'm not mistaken, was in the Bavarian radio and now is a professor at the Hanns Eisler. And at the same time, this links to a question from Anastasia Budanok, who you probably know from her activities as an agent. So Benoit asks, good afternoon, how do you engage artists, conductors, soloists? Do you only trust agents, ... or your emotions and artists yourself, or marketing trends? And then at the same time, to couple that with one of the questions from Anastasia, she asks, does an artist's online profile, for example, the size of their existing digital community, play a role in your programming decisions? So somewhat provocative or leading questions, but I couldn't resist passing them on.
Well, look, ultimately, I have to trust my ears and my judgment, but I always have this little rule. If I hear about if I hear a new name about an artist, on three separate occasions, if three people whose opinions I know and trust say, look, oh, we had a great time with X pianist or Y conductor, that will certainly prompt me to do a little bit more investigation and see if I can find an opportunity to go and hear that person in a live performance. So I sort of rely on the network. I've got to be honest, and I'm somewhat hardened to a hard sell by agents. This is from years of experience. One can tell, a mile off if someone is trying to oversell an artist, and that's always a danger sign for me. So I tend to rely on what I hear through my network, and then I try to follow that up. Certainly nowadays, and this is in response to Anastasia's question, there are many elements that make up the profile of an artist, and there are some who remain incredibly press shy and who don't want to embrace all of the possibilities of social media, and others who do it brilliantly. And I think ultimately it has to be, the artistry and the musical chemistry that is the thing that we have to think through most carefully. One of the things about our society is that we are, in an age where the cult of celebrity is very high, and there's a lot of noise, a lot of static out there, and just to be able to cut through all of that and be able to see where genuine talent lies, and know when an artist is ready to make an appearance at a certain level. Coming to work with the Boston Symphony is a wonderful but daunting prospect. And if an artist is not quite at the right point in their career where they've got the experience of enough life in the concert world to be able to come and appear with a big orchestra like this, it can be awfully damaging. I know of conductors who we've brought in at a young age who, weren't quite there yet. And it's some of them have gone on to have a tremendous career, but it took us a long time to be able to persuade them to come back to us, because their first experience was one that was too soon. And I blame myself for that in a couple of instances. And it's a hard thing to rebound from if it's not exactly the right point and the right conditions. I should have said, as a backdrop to when I was talking more generally about the work that we do in our field, that, really our job is to create the conditions under which an artist can absolutely perform at their best. That they're coming to a major engagement with exactly the right repertoire, with the right collaborators, that they're being tended to in terms of the practical aspects of their visit, their accommodations and travel. They're being compensated in a way that they feel is adequate. So we have to find those conditions in just the right balance, so that when an artist goes out onto the platform, they can absolutely do their best, that they're feeling that they're completely supported, they're confident in the repertoire that they're doing, they've got a passion about what they're about to perform and present. And for me, that's the ultimate goal for someone in my job, is to make sure that those conditions are created, and that it invariably, I think, leads to the best results possible at any point in time.
And there's actually a question that's about programming that has come in from Joshua Barrow, whom you know from the New York Times. And Joshua asks, how could programming become more flexible? For example, this week institutions have posted statements of solidarity with Black Lives Matter protests, but often the industry moves too glacially to take meaningful action in a timely way. What would it take to, say, edit repertoire or representation in response to our moment? And I must say, on a non-political note, but responding to the other crisis raging that we've all been affected by, the epidemic, one sees now in Europe a much more improvised approach to, we'll play this next week. And one sees that improvised approach sometimes with cancellations, where something you've been working on for 4 years and you're able to come up with almost as good of a replacement within 24 hours. So, could you speak about flexibility in programming, both in response to the political and just the artistic considerations?
Look, it's a matter of balancing expectations. And by that, we often find that our patrons really want to know what we're going to be playing. They've spent their time thinking about it. It's maybe a work that they're very passionate about. When there's a change of program, they're disappointed for a variety of reasons. On the other hand, I agree entirely with Josh, and I think we are often too bound up in our planning, that we often plan too far ahead, which is why I said I like to try and leave a couple of weeks where we can respond to a number of conditions, whether it be the arrival on the scene of an artist or of a soloist. But ultimately, we can, if we want to change something, we can. And as I think the point you make, Kirill, about a cancellation is a very good example, because certainly when an artist cancels, it's very disappointing for those who are looking forward to it, but these things happen, human nature. If we're able to come up with a replacement that is just as viable and just as exciting, I think people enjoy that aspect of it as well. I think it also just partly depends on what scale of performance you're thinking of. If symphony orchestra programs are put together well in advance, the players are usually thinking about the preparation for any particular work over a long period of time. the whole machinery is in place in terms of the musical parts and the materials that they're going to play from, or if it's a brand new piece, that the work is finished and the artists have time to learn it. So with a big machine like an orchestra, it is sometimes more difficult to be flexible and to turn on a dime when needed for whatever reason, whether it be in response to something that's happening in our time, or in response to some necessary change.
And so, in response, maybe it's not to the immediate eruptions, but for example, in the last years, and very deservedly, there's a lot of discussion, especially around classical programming, in the balance between female and male conductors, soloists, and composers, and of course the question of racial equality is as important. And I'm sure these are questions that you are often asked, but it would be amiss not to ask them now as well. If you could speak about, let's start with the female conductors, male conductors, soloists, and how you can balance these societal pressures and expectations with the industry situation, with the market situation right now, and how that's developing at a slower pace.
Yes, yeah. I think again, it's making the right decision in each individual case. But ultimately, if you've got, all things being equal, you can go this direction or that, and the zeitgeist is that we should be going that direction. I think that's a responsibility that we all have. I must say, over the last few years, I've thought very, very carefully about this matter of gender balance in relation to repertoire, and it's prompted me to go back and explore composers and listen to works that I hadn't heard before, or I hadn't paid enough attention to. And it's made me think more carefully about if I've got a choice between male or female composer, what is the best thing to do, or there. But they has to be good quality, otherwise you end up with some sort of tokenism. And I think that does no one any good. It's a sort of scattergun approach that you just put one piece here and that just for the sake of having. I think that's unfair on everyone. I think it's unfair on the composers themselves. It's unfair on the audience who, believes in us as being an organization who will present quality work. But I think we can all be more imaginative about it. The matter of female conductors is a bigger challenge, and I think it's one that we are able to at least contribute to from a training point of view. And we have a very distinguished conducting program at Tanglewood that's been in existence since 1940. And over the years, I think, especially in the last years, the balance between male and female fellows has been pretty much even, and a lot of the recent participants in the program are now out having terrific careers. I'm so proud of Karina Kanalakis and Ruth Reinhardt and Gemma New, and I could go through a long list. And these are artists who are starting to appear with the orchestras around the world. They're starting to show up on our calendars, and I think that's great. But again, it's finding the opportunity that is the most appropriate and the most supportive for an artist. You don't want to put them into a situation where they're going to sink because they don't have the technical or the experiential muscle to be able to cope in difficult and challenging situations, which is what working with a big high-profile orchestra is about.
Yeah, and maybe it's time. There's still so it's like a tree of questions that one wants to ask you about. But it might be time to speak about Tanglewood. Some people here know Tanglewood very well and what it does. Some European instrumental students, particularly, I'm thinking of, may benefit from learning about Tanglewood a bit more. And I think you would agree that this is a very important component of your job, and I think one that you really derive a lot of pleasure from. But the relationship between Tanglewood, not just as a venue where the Boston Symphony plays in a wonderful setting, but as an educational institution and the influence that has.
Yes. Well, look, if I can focus on the educational part of it, well, just to give a little backdrop, Tanglewood started as a series of summer concerts for essentially New Yorkers who were holidaying here in the Berkshires. So the festival started in earnest in 1937, and has grown enormously just in the last decade. It's a series of performances by the BSO, and they give 3 concerts per weekend, essentially 3 different programs, for which there are 2 rehearsals. So again, finding the mix of familiar and less familiar repertoire is a real challenge. And within any one weekend, thinking about the workload of the orchestra, how they can cope with the amount of music that they need to prepare. We often bring back a major piece that we may have done during the winter season, and it's amazing how quickly the orchestra can reheat that piece and bring it to a very high level of performance. So we have the orchestra programs, we have the celebrity recital series in Ozawa Hall, and that includes some of the major chamber music performers of today, some emerging artists. The programming is somewhat more eclectic than the programming for the main stage with the BSO, ranging from early music to very new music. So that's, I guess, what we might call the main stage of Tanglewood, but equally as important, and I say this in a world sense, is the work of the Tanglewood Music Center, which has been this pre-professional training program that's existed since 1940. And each summer there are about 150 fellows, a full symphony orchestra, a group of singers, maybe 6 or 7 composers, and just 2 conducting fellows for the last few years. And they come and they have a 2-month immersion at Tanglewood. It's for many of them, it's the last moment before they start to engage in the professional musical world. So they'll leave Tanglewood and they may start auditioning for orchestral positions, either with opera companies or with symphony orchestras or whatever. So it's sort of like the last haven that they have. They are provided with the room and food and lodging, and they work very intensively with a number of coaches, many of them members of the Boston Symphony. They perform symphony programs, they perform chamber music. Importantly, they play a lot of new music. New music is a very, very important part of the diet of a fellow coming to Tanglewood. But they also learn what it is that our industry and our field needs these days. So the skill set is very different. It's not just about being able to perform a sonata or a quartet or symphony up to a very high level, but it's being able to engage with an audience, engage with their community. It's a far more comprehensive set of skills that we try and help our fellows with each summer. The numbers for this are incredibly important. Among American orchestras, I think it's somewhere like 35 to 40% of the players in the symphony orchestras around the US now spent some time at Tanglewood. In terms of the principal players, it's an even higher percentage. If you look at the conductors who've come through Tanglewood, over the years. It's a very impressive array, starting from Bernstein himself through Lauren Mazel and Christoph von Dohnanyi and Charles Dutoit, through Marin Alsop, and the list goes on. So it's been a great training ground for young conductors as well. And it's a hothouse atmosphere where there's a lot happening. There would be, in any one day, there's probably 3 or 4 concerts that take place of different scales. As I said, new music is a very prominent part of the life of Tanglewood. Over the years, there have been some significant figures in new music who've been associated with the Tanglewood Music Center. Copeland, of course, was the first head of school, but Gunther Schuller was director of the program for many years. Ollie Nussen, Reinbert de Leo, Tom Addis is the current director of new music activities. So it's been a very prominent place for the creation of new music and support of new music. The third arm of Tanglewood is the one that we created just last year, and that's what's called the Tanglewood Learning Institute. And I had been for many years worried that we were just not taking advantage of a number of opportunities to really come closer to music. And each summer we would have some incredible figures in the musical world come, or we'd have important performances happening. And we just didn't have the mechanism in which we could do the sort of contextualization of it, the deep dive into certain subjects, the ability to really allow an artist to share their deep knowledge about a certain area of the repertoire of their career. And I always thought it was a terrible lost opportunity. So we came up with the idea of having what became known as the Tanglewood Learning Institute. And it's not only a set of programs, it's a set of buildings where we can operate this type of activity through lectures, panel discussions, workshops, taking some of the musical figures who are coming to Tanglewood or particular strands of repertoire and really exploring those in great detail. And we had a tremendous first season. We had great plans in place for this season, and I'm glad that we've been able to retain some of those. Just for anyone who may have missed the press release or the write-ups, we decided when it became clear that we couldn't go ahead with the plans that we had in place for the 2020 season, we decided that we would, it was important. We didn't want to go dark. We didn't want to lose contact with our audience for what would have been a 21-month period. So we decided to try and transfer as much of the festival that we had into place from an in-person to an online context. And this is a combination of offering some archival materials that have never been available before, some bespoke new performances. So there are a number of artists who are within the radius of Tanglewood and coming here, and they're recording some new programs. And so we're able to represent all of the 3 main elements of Tanglewood: the main stage, the TMC, the TLI, in a virtual field. There's a whole set of programs for the fellows of the Tanglewood Music Center that's still happening. There's most of the TLI programming is being moved over into the digital world. So I'm very curious. It's a grand experiment, that's for sure. I had to do some persuasive selling to our board, who put up the additional resources that we needed to create this. But you know, in the current state of the pandemic, we don't know how much longer this will be the world in which we're operating. So we needed to really give it our best shot and see where that takes us. One of the curious things for me is what we're going to be faced with when we come out of the current situation and now getting back to some sort of regular musical life. You know, we've opened all these doors, which is into the digital world now, and certainly nothing replaces the experience of sharing emotional experiences in real time with other people, which is what the essence of attending a concert is about. But I think we'll have new opportunities, and I think it's up to our imaginations and our good judgment to see what from all of this we can carry into the future and how we can perhaps reach new audiences.
I will ask you more about your thoughts on the future, but in some way getting to it. And there was a question from Susanne Klingenstein, who is a literature scholar and professor at MIT in the Boston area, avid concertgoer to the Boston Symphony, and she asks you about something that, pardon me, you can even in your span at the BSO observe something. She says, "Why are you worried about losing the young? Going to an evening at the Symphony seems to be much less relevant to the culture than it was just 20 years ago." Well, the question is, first of all, have you observed, let's say in your 25 years, what are the changes in the audience? To my eyes, when I come to the BSO to play or to listen, that you have quite an outstanding number of younger, more colored haircuts than gray or bald in the audience than a number of other American orchestras. But what are some of the changes you are observing, and what are some of the things that you are perhaps undertaking to attract the so-called younger segment of the audience?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm very glad to say that we seem to be bucking the trend. When I came to the BSO, the average age was in the high 60s, and now we're in the low 40s, which is quite an achievement.
So I'm sure everybody every orchestra manager in the audience will say, "How did you do that?"
Well, look, we really invested in it, and it's probably getting on close to 10 years ago now. We're fortunate that we live in a city which has a number of educational institutions, and so there is a large student population in town. So we created, with some donor support, because one has to look at the financial viability of all of these things, but we created a program called the College Card. And if if the educational institution that you are attending is one of the participating ones in the College Card program, through your college you can buy for $35, I think, you get something that looks like a little credit card, and whenever we have inventory for a concert, if it's not a sellout, we make known to those who are members of the College Card program a few days ahead that if you show up on Thursday at 7:30, you will get the best available seat in the house without further payment. And this has had a tremendous effect. It's also great in that, if there is a program that for whatever reason hasn't sold so well, whether it's time of year or program or whatever it is, we can reach out to this community of young listeners, and we get all of the great energy of their presence in the hall. So it works in many ways, and we've been doing this program for long enough now that we've seen those who were part of the College Card program have now graduated, so to speak, to be full-time subscribers. We also keep a relationship with them, so we can, on a single ticket basis, we can reach out and promote concerts that we know that they may have shown interest in a particular performer or a composer or whatever in the past during their years as students. And so we can do some really targeted marketing, and it's certainly paid off. I think on any night there's a very, KIRILL, as you say, a very significant number of blue hairs and orange hairs and so on in the hall, and that energy is really palpable. And then we have a couple of other things. We of course, we've had rush ticket programs for a long time. We have a program where if you are under 40, you can get a ticket for $25, I believe. We also have on 4 Friday evenings throughout the year a series called Casual Fridays. that has a social element before and afterwards. The musicians speak from the stage. So we've tried, pulling a number of levers to open the doors to younger audiences, and I think it's really had a great effect. And I'm thrilled. I sit in the hall and I look around, and it's not an aging audience. It's a young and constantly renewing audience, and I'm thrilled and very proud about what we've achieved in that way.
Well, it's amazing, and it's also gratifying to hear it's been possible to realize this, at least within the parameters of the Boston Symphony and its finances, that you can lower the financial bar for the students to enter. And I think especially for some of our European guests, but generally it would be interesting, without disclosing us the real secrets, but from the official information, the percentage of box office that ends up being part of the budget for financing a given program, and also therefore how much the box office success, so to say, is important to you in the artistic mission.
Mm-hmm. Look, box office versus contributed, it's about 50-50 nowadays. When I first came to the organization, it was probably 65% box office, 35% contributed. So the balance has changed, and it's changed partly because we're doing some of this subsidized programming, which I think is an important investment. But, I think all of us in the area of artistic planning, it's a responsibility that we have to come up with seasons that are viable from a marketing point of view. And so it's a constant consideration. And, nothing makes me happier than if I go to a program that is in all of its dimensions satisfying. It's, for me, the right balance of familiar, unfamiliar, taking me in new directions, that the orchestra plays it superbly because they've had sufficient rehearsal time, that they're clearly enjoying working with the conductor and soloist, and that we have a full house. For me, that ticks all the boxes. And I come away thinking I've done a reasonably good job on that one occasion, at least.
And not a very long question, one from Min Young Kwon. Do the members of the Boston Symphony have any involvement in shaping the programming? And I think that would be interesting for many to know.
That's a very important question. And programming by committee is rarely successful. I think there needs to be some unity of approach and conception. And for me, the smaller the team that's working on any set of programs, the better. That being said, one has to listen to the input of those who are reacting to it, whether it be those who are going to be performing, or those in the marketing team who are going to be selling it, or clearly what the audience response is going to be. What I find is at a certain point in the planning, I'll present the outline to, we have a small artistic advisory committee from the orchestra, and just get a sense from them about how they're viewing the season in terms of what I described when I was talking about my single page option of the hot spots and the workflow for them throughout the year. Sometimes they will give me some insights into what the challenges of a program might be for them that I have no sense of. I'm not a wind player, I'm not a string player. I can't speak to what the physical challenges of any particular program may be, and that I find very, very useful. And it's led over the years to our making some sometimes small, sometimes significant adjustments to the programs. I'm always very, very interested to hear what ideas the players have, and I'm always happy to incorporate those where we can, or to bring them to a conductor as part of any discussion. But ultimately, there has to be some clarity of line in putting together the programs. And my experience over the years is that in a way, the clearer that line is, the more successful the presentation and the product in the end will be.
Yes, I think once a concert presenter, a very good recital presenter, said that benevolent dictatorship is the best form of governing a concert series. But whatever we think about that. But of course, now turning to the current situation, and I'm sure you're asked this a lot, and in many ways we're all trying to feel out what this will mean, not just for classical music, but for our society at large. But and I think it's correct to say that the symphony orchestra was already under some pressure in the society as this big organization that sometimes has its advantages and disadvantages, and the mobility and time spans, etc. But what are your thoughts currently on how music making and how symphony orchestra and how the Boston Symphony may look once we are hopefully emerging or continuing to live through this crisis? And the question is where we draw the line, whether the crisis has stopped and real life has resumed. So tell a little bit about this in your mind.
Look, I think we're in something of a wait and see mode. You know, the US seems to be somewhat later in the recovery phase than Europe, and I'm just in the course of the last few days I've been talking to a number of European colleagues to hear what they're planning and what steps they're taking, and I'm feeling quite envious of them. We're not quite there yet, but we can only try to plot out what the future path may be for us, at least over the next 12 months. Fortunately, our concert year divides up into some clear segments. We would be just about to start the Tanglewood season now. We then go into the fall subscription season. There's a period over the holidays where the orchestra morphs from the Boston Symphony to the Boston Pops, and they play a number of holiday concerts. We then go back to subscriptions. We then have a spring pop season, and then the cycle continues again. So in a way, we have got sort of definite markers, and what we're doing is just looking at each of those units of a season and seeing at what point we need to really enact on something. At what point do we need to say, okay, it's clear that we can bring the orchestra back together in whatever size, whether it be a very small ensemble or a medium-sized orchestra. Can we have an audience? What are the priorities? You know, is it worth, if we can have an audience of only 200, is it the right investment for us to have to cover all of the health and safety precautions for that a number of people? Are we better to invest in purely this digital world that we've now created and do multiple performances within a week and so on? So these are all questions, and I don't know the answers, but I think the best we can do at the moment is just to try and be as informed as we can about what the various options may be, and then circumstances will help guide us through that. You know, we're obviously, the health and safety of our musicians or any potential audience has got to be the first and paramount concern. But we will have to work within the constraints that the federal and state government allow us, and abide by those conditions. And then, of course, the unknown thing is just the level of comfort of an audience. I can tell you from our musicians' point of view, they can't get back together to play soon enough. Obviously, there are some of them who are somewhat more nervous about being together in a big group, but in fact, once I finish in this session with you, I have a phone meeting with a number of our musicians to settle on some chamber music programs that they're going to be recording as part of our Tanglewood online summer offerings. And I can just, the sense of the prospect that they're going to be back with their colleagues again and creating music is absolutely palpable. So I can only speak from the player's point of view that know that this is a very, very passionate and prized next step that they're going to be taking. But it's our job as management to say, look, okay, we can take this next step, or we need to wait a little longer. We have to gather as much information. Fortunately, you colleagues in Europe have been very, very systematic in documenting the approaches that have been taken, and I think that's going to help inform what we do. And ultimately, you know, any decision that we make has to be the right decision for our community and our local market. I think what's going to be possible in Boston is very different from what's possible in Dallas or in New York or San Diego. So I think that there's no general rule to go by. I think it's each case by case, and one has to be as informed and thoughtful as one can before taking whatever the next move may be.
Yeah, and you mentioned the digital offerings that the Boston Symphony has created with its resources, and I think we're all seeing incredible amount of content that is spun out on an hour by hour, whether it's the orchestra that has spliced itself in its in individual rooms, or it's somebody live streaming from their living room. And a lot of it, or most of it in fact, is free. And I think then we have anyway the generation that has grown up with streaming services, which make almost everything accessible at a rather low price. So have we, with where you're positioned in the industry, do you feel that we've in some way put ourselves into a corner where content is expected to be free, and artists have depended on concert fees? Now there are currently no concerts, and obviously that has created, I get many calls that say, well, we have this new wonderful platform, we're going to sell tickets and people will come and pay these digital tickets. And then I think, but I could type Horowitz, Chopin, Mazurka and see him playing in Musikverein, and that's pretty amazing and free. So what's the way forward there? And do you think there is a way forward there?
Yes, well, in fact, we're trying this for our Tanglewood program. So we've got a number of artists who are coming, and these were artists who were all scheduled to appear at Tanglewood this summer. So there's already an engagement between our audience and them, and they're coming and recording some programs especially for these particular series that we're doing, and we're going to offer them on a digital fee basis, and we just have to see what the response is. But I think at a certain point, unless we try and test this model, we won't really know whether it's valid or not. I think the thing is that we are connecting to a particular audience and a particular performer, and I think that's the key part of it. Of course, you know, going online and hearing Horowitz in you know, a concert from the Concertgebouw is wonderful, but you know, I never had the great pleasure of hearing Horowitz in person. Whereas I have heard Daniil Trifonov many times, or Emmanuel Ax. I'm thinking just a couple of the artists who are going to be part of our series. And so that gives a different perspective on it. I may be more interested to hear Daniil again, because I really enjoyed his performance last season with the BSO in Symphony Hall. And boy, he's coming to do the Art of Fugue, and isn't that wonderful? So look, I'll try. So Kirill, this is a conversation we should maybe have at the end of August again, once we've tried our grand experiment. But I think it's a time where we just do have to try and think of new ways forward that make a new financial model that may somehow work in this interim period, and see what happens. There is a tremendous amount of free material out there, and of very variable quality, and one can very easily poke around and find just about anything. What we're doing in our project is to create unique material that's never before seen, archival performances, or it's brand new. And we hope that that element at least will be strong enough to at least capture part of the market's imagination.
And the plan is, just so I understand correctly, the plan is that you will be charging, let's say, digital admission tickets.
Yeah, for some of them. We're having a mix of paid and free. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how that all pans out.
And the grounds at Tanglewood, even the outdoors things are not possible this summer based on whatever is happening.
Well, we're opening up the Tanglewood grounds basically 3 days a week, the weekends and Wednesday mornings. And, part of the gestalt of Tanglewood is just this mixture of great music making and the spirituality of the landscape. And even though I was over there the other day and it's manicured splendor at the moment, it's looking like I am a bit scruffy. But one still gets the great sense of the energy and the inspiration for the landscape. So we've worked out how we can make it available. It'll be a limited number of people who can be on the grounds at any time, and they have to do all the appropriate social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. But we just felt it was incredibly important for those who can still come here to have the chance to be part of the landscape and nature and that spirit.
That's great. And so if we stay just for a moment longer on the subject of let's say media projects, there's a audience member, a very active one, Jari Kallio, who writes a lot about particularly about modern music, and has in fact, I think, followed the Others Concerto maybe to 3 or 4 different cities, and
impressive.
Really impressive, and has a fantastic blog that I think you've seen articles from. He asks about. He says, "Thank you for an insightful, inspired talk. As someone placed on the other side of the Atlantic, I've been delighted by the many superb recordings over the years, given that I can't visit the Symphony Hall in Tanglewood that often. The new recording featuring the 2 masterpieces has been a huge pleasure. Could you share some insight about future recording projects and especially taking into account the current situation with the coronavirus?" And I think that would be interesting. Of course, we know about the ongoing Shostakovich cycle, and is there something else that you can tell us without breaking the vow of secrecy?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you, Kirill, because there are a couple of other big projects, and they haven't been announced yet. So
for now, it's the continuation of the
anyway, we're on the home stretch for Shostakovich. So this season, I hope I maybe push back a year, but we were to do the final 2 symphonies, numbers 13 and number 3, which were the last 2 we had to record. And we're also recording Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, which has been a tremendous project to work on. It's a fantastic cast that we've been able to assemble. So that will be the next phase of the Shostakovich cycle, and we're recording the piano concertos, the cello concertos, and the violin concertos in the next couple of years as well. And then after that, we have a couple of other big symphonic cycles, and as I mentioned, I'm not at liberty to let you know what they are, but one of them is tied into a major tour that we're undertaking, European tour in spring of 2022. So trying to get the timing of making all of the recordings available, working with, in this case, Deutsche Grammophon, as to when we would release them to have the ideal synergy between the live performances and the recording market is something that we've worked very, very hard on. So but it's great fun. We, just so everyone knows, we record live in concert, and we did certain upgrades to our technical facilities a few years ago. So we have pretty much this state-of-the-art equipment there. Our routine is that after every performance, Andres and I sit down with the engineer and perhaps the producer and listen through to the performance that has just been given. And over the course of 3 or 4 performances, we can see that we have everything covered from an editing point of view. And normally by about the 3rd performance, if there's 4 performances, we can pretty much be certain that we've got everything covered. I think so far in having recorded all but 2 of the Shostakovich symphonies, and then beyond that we recorded Brahms symphonies and Sibelius, and I think we've had in all of that 2 patch sessions of 15 minutes. So it's a pretty impressive approach, and it's yielded some great recordings, I think. And then beyond that, Kirill's performance of the Sony Concerto was initially, when we planned the performances, was not intended for release on CD, but it was of such incredible quality that we were fortunate that working with Mirios, that we were able to release that recording. Excuse me, and fortunate that we were able to do it because we had a very high quality material to work with from an audio point of view. Likewise, the Addis disc that came out recently was Totentanz was not intended for disc, but it was there. It was a superb performance. The concerto, we had always the intention of committing it to a recording, and the same process happened, that Tom and Kirill after each concert would come and listen to what we had, and it does actually help their thinking in terms of the performance, and know what we need to cover and what we need to focus on for the upcoming show.
And perhaps now, and I know soon we should let you go with the busy schedule of calls that you have. At the beginning, you spoke about the activities of the Boston Symphony, and then the thing that's planned perhaps almost as far out as anything are the tours. And it would be interesting to hear your take on the importance of orchestral touring. I mean, obviously there is the, in the best sense, the vanity aspect of the touring, and of projecting the orchestra's prowess in guest locations, but also now we can follow so well through recordings and video and other media possibilities. So what are the important factors in touring at all for an orchestra nowadays?
I think touring has a great effect on the morale of an orchestra and the sense of ensemble. They're constantly having to work in unfamiliar acoustics, so it heightens their sense of being able to respond and listen more carefully. We're lucky that we play most of our concerts in Symphony Hall, and for us, practically every other hall in the world is a step down. I'm embarrassed to say that, but it's marvelous to see how the orchestra can somehow quickly respond to a particular acoustic and somehow find their way in it. So first of all, it heightens the sense of artistic acumen of the players. It's a great focus for the pride of our city. The fact that the BSO is off appearing in the important music capitals of the world is something that is a source of enormous pleasure for the regular concert goers of the orchestra to hear. It's important as a focus for some fundraising. It also helps us with certain of our media activities. So on all of those levels, it's an investment that we think is worth taking. And it is a big investment. Rarely does a tour nowadays pay for itself. You always need the support of sponsors or donors, and of course, it's an arduous undertaking. for the musicians themselves. The days are often very long of travel and then performance, and they're away from their homes, but we think, all things considered, it's something that's very important. We went for a period without touring. I'm happy to say that Andres loves touring and every year wants to see us on the road, and we're happy to be able to continue doing that for as long as they remain financially viable in whatever way.
It's a very clear answer and a good cause, and certainly the Boston Symphony is an orchestra that's, in the best sense, very fit musically and instrumentally, and I think spiritually, and certainly your programming keeps them awake and in shape. And I can only hope that that very soon, for all of us, the walls of Symphony Hall are going to be vibrating as they have been for all the past decades. So unless I fear that I missed some question, or if there's perhaps something that you, Tony, would want to add before we let you go.
Only my thanks, Kirill, for giving me this opportunity. I'm sorry I can't see everyone who's listening, but I appreciate there being, I've seen various comments come up here on the screen, and thank you very much for those. And I wish everyone, either who's in the field of arts administration, great luck with the many challenges that you're all facing. I hope that those who are perhaps new to it have found something of interest, or I've been able to enlighten on what may have been a mystery if you're a regular concert goer. So I hope it's been useful in that sense. So thank you so much for your time. Kirill, thank you. I feel honored. I was intimidated when I heard some of the others who have been participating in this series, and I felt very much I was at the bottom end of the scale. So
not in my opinion. It's wonderful that you're here and open the thinking for us that goes into what you do, which is a very, very, very essential and results in wonderful music. Before everybody goes, I wanted to just mention about next week, which is June 10th, and it will be again at 6 o'clock, and the Hungarian musicologist Gergely Fazekas will present a lecture that he titles Kurtág Translating Beckett. And this is obviously a lecture on Kurtág's recent opera, Fin de Partie. And I'll post the registration link in a second into the chat. Hope to see you there. I wanted to read to you the paragraph that Gergely sent about what he intends to speak on. He quotes the New York Times, a patiently perfect opera setting Samuel Beckett's Endgame to create an uncompromising work that is utterly distinctive, said The Guardian. Fin de Partie, the long-awaited first opera by the last representative of post-war art music, the 94-year-old Hungarian composer György Kurtág, had its first performance in November 2018 in one of the most prestigious opera houses in the world, La Scala in Milan. The opera makes intensive use of the 400-year-old genre's well-known techniques. While its musical language is true to Kurtág's style, some basic elements of the opera's music can be found already in the earliest pieces of Kurtág written in the late 1950s. Based on interviews made with and using excerpts from a yet unpublished documentary on the opera, the lecture gives an introduction to Fin de Partie, to Kurtág's music, and to his more than 60-year-old relationship with Beckett's texts. So I very much hope that whoever is able to make the time in their schedule will tune in and learn more about Kurtág. And for now, I thank all of you very much. Here's the info, if I manage the copy and paste function, which is a variable factor. And stay well and stay healthy.